So now to build this auth screen here in my Flutter project, I'll add a new folder in the lib folder, which I'll name screens to store my screen widgets in there. And in that folder, I'll add a new auth.dart file. The name, of course, is up to you, but in there, I want to create that off-screen widget, which in the end will be responsible for collecting that user input. Now for that, in there, we of course create a new class, which I'll name authScreen, and which here extends stateful widget. And I'll extend stateful widget here because I will render a form and collect some user data through that form. And for that, we'll have to use some features that require a stateful widget. Now in this stateful widget here, I'll add my constructor of screen, where I accept and forward that key, and where I add that createState method. And then we also add this underscore off-screen state class in addition to the off-screen widget class, where we extend the state object that will be connected to the off-screen class. And that will also be the case here, of course. And in that state class here, we have that build method, as we always do, and as we always did throughout this entire course. With that, we can then instantiate this authScreen state class here in the createState method. And then here in the build method, we return our widget tree for this screen. And here I want to start with a scaffold because, of course, I want to make sure that we do have this nice styling and this background color that we might want to have. And on that scaffold here, I'll add the background color parameter to add, guess what, a background color to that scaffold. And here I'll use my theme of constructor function with the context to get hold of my theme setup or to my theme settings. And then there we can access the color scheme property. And then there I want to use the primary property, so the primary color that I did in the end set up. In addition to setting that background color here, I'll also add the body parameter. And then here I want to render the actual auth form. Now for that, here I'll render a center widget so that all the content inside of it will take the entire width and height of the screen and will be centered in that width and height. And then inside of center, I want to have a child that is a single child scroll view because I'm going to add a column with multiple text inputs here. And I want to make sure that even if the keyboard is open, all these inputs and buttons are always reachable. So therefore, I ensure that the content will be scrollable by wrapping single child scroll view around a column. And that column will then hold the actual inputs and so on. Now on that column, I'll set main axis alignment to main axis alignment center to again center all the content inside of this column. And then here we'll have a couple of children, of course, a couple of child widgets. Now when it comes to those child widgets, I want to start with a container to add some margin to it with edge insets only to target the different directions individually, to add a top margin of 30, a bottom margin of 20, and also a left and right margin of 20. Those values should ensure that this container will be positioned exactly the way I want to position it. But what's the purpose of this container, you might wonder? Well, the purpose is to, in the end, display an image. So that will be the child of the container. I'll also add a width to the container to set this to 200 pixels to size this image appropriately. Now, when it comes to that image, you'll find the chat PNG file attached. And I will create a new folder in my project here, which I'll name assets. And in there, I'll add an images folder. And in there, I'll store that attached chat.png file. So that's inside of assets images. With that image added here, I'll also go to pubspec.yaml because, as you learned earlier in the course, if you have some asset like an image in your project that should be usable in your app code, you also have to go to the pubspec.yaml file and comment in this assets part here and then simply reference that asset, so that image, for example, that should be available. So here the assets/images/chat.png path, pointing at the image we added here. With that added, we can go back to auth.dart, and in that widget here, inside of this container, I'll now use the image asset constructor function to reference that image I just added, which is in that assets/images/chat.png path here. So with that, I'm effectively setting up a container with some margin and with a fixed width that will display this image. And I'm simply adding this for styling reasons to make this app or this screen look good. Below this container, I then want to have the actual authentication form. So below this container here, I'll add a card widget like this to have this nice card styling, this nice card look. And here on this card, I'll also add some margin and set this to edge insets all 20 like this, to add a margin of 20 in all directions around the card. And then the child of this card here will be yet another single child scroll view to ensure that the content inside of this card is scrollable and all the content is always reachable. And here I'll wrap this around a padding widget to add some inner padding inside of that card. So between the borders of that card, the edges of the card, and the actual card content. And the amount of padding is then set up with the padding parameter. And here I'll set this to edge insets all 16. And then the child of that padding will be that form. So ultimately that authentication form, which we want to build. And for that, I'll use the form widget provided by Flutter, about which you also learned in greater detail in an earlier course section. And this form will then display a column widget. It will contain a column widget, which in the end will display the individual form inputs, so the different text fields that will be displayed. Now for that here, on that column, I'll set the main axis size to main axis size min to make sure that this column will only take as much space as needed by its content, essentially, instead of taking as much space as it can get and having no boundaries on the vertical axis. And then the children of this inner column in that form, in that card, will, as mentioned, be those input elements. And for that here, we can, for example, add a text form field, which should allow users to enter their email address. And therefore, I want to add a label that tells them such by adding the decoration parameter and adding an input decoration object here to configure the decoration of this text form field. And then here we can set the label text parameter in that input decoration constructor function here to email address, for example. And this can be a const object. Now, in addition to setting that label, I also want to set the keyboard type of this text form field to text input type email address, which, as the name suggests, in the end ensures that the soft keyboard that will be opened will be optimized for entering email addresses by, for example, ensuring that the @ symbol is easy to reach. In addition, I'll add another property which we haven't used before in the course, and that will be the autocorrect property, which I'll set to false to turn off autocorrection, because that can of course be super annoying if you're entering an email address and you're getting corrected all the time. In addition, we can also set text capitalization to text capitalization none to ensure that the email address won't get capitalized, so that the first character of the email address won't be uppercase, because that can also be very annoying. Now with that, we have a basic text form field, and I'm not done with it yet. There are still a couple of key features missing, but I want to see something on the screen, and therefore I will just copy this to also add another text form field that allows users to enter their password by adding a label text of password to that next text form field. And here the keyboard type will actually be the regular text keyboard type, and therefore I'll remove this. I also will remove autocorrect and text capitalization, but here, since this input will be all about users entering their password, I'll set another very important parameter on text form field. I'll set the obscure text parameter to true, which simply hides the characters as they are being entered, so that if someone were to stand behind the person using that app, that person couldn't see the entered password. Well, and with that, as mentioned, we're absolutely not done with this form. There's a lot missing here, but we have these two input fields in that form, in that card, on that auth screen, and I just want to make sure that we're going into the right direction. Therefore, I'll save that file, and back in main Dart, we can now import and use that auth screen. So here I'll import from my chat app project, and there from the screens folder, the auth.dart file. And with this import added here, we can then of course go down here and set auth screen as the widget that should be displayed in our app here. And here we can add const. With that, if we then run this app here, we will be greeted by this basic authentication screen. As mentioned, not finished, but not looking too bad. And here, if I tap into this email address field, you'll see that a soft keyboard opened up that makes entering email addresses quite convenient by giving us this @ symbol here, so that we can enter our email addresses here with great ease. And the password field, on the other hand, gives us a regular keyboard, but if I enter something here, you see that those characters are obscured, which of course also is great.